We're going to finish off our last part of lesson 11. We've written our unit tests for our products index. But now we want to unit test the details method, and I would suggest there are 4 tests we need. We want to check what happens when we call details with no ID. Right now it returns a 404 response. We want to check what happens if we have an ID, but that ID doesn't exist in the database. Right now, again, returns a 404. And then I think we want 2 tests. When we have a valid ID, we first should make sure we are getting the product object we expect. And second, we should write a test to make sure we get the view that we expect. And so we'll need 4 tests here for this. The details, invalid, or actually, sorry, we'll say details, null ID, loads 404. So we don't need any arrange here. Again, we've already got the arranging. We can use what's done in test initialize. So we're just going to act and assert. So let's try view result, controller.details, and let's pass in a null. Oh, again, we need a result, as it's an asynchronous task. Now let's look at this for just a second. So what should happen if we have no ID and we call details? What actually happens in the application right now? Let's go try it. So if I go to products and details, but I remove the ID, right now we actually get this. It's actually a bit incomplete. Whoops. So if I go here, right, we do get a 404 response. So we're getting the right status code, but our behavior of our application actually isn't great. What should we probably do instead of just showing this, instead of giving our user a blank screen? So again, our unit test is kind of indicating to us there's a shortcoming in the program. We could forward them to the main page. Okay, that would be one option. Any other suggestions? So yes, we could do a redirect. Okay, normally we probably should have a 404 page. So let's create this view. And then if we have no ID, instead of just returning a 404 code, let's actually direct the user to that 404. So inside of views, I'm going to go to shared, and I'm going to add an empty view. Again, inside of views and shared, let's create a 404 page. Every website should have a 404 page. I'm going to create an empty view that I'll just call 404. So our page is just going to say, sorry, we couldn't find that page. So then I want to modify the code in the controller in the details method. Instead of just returning a 404 error, we actually want to return the view called 404. So on line 38, we are going to return the view with the name 404. So the scaffolding, what it does, I would say, is kind of incomplete. So now if I go here, right? We get this instead. We get redirected off. We might even be able to set the status code. I think you say dot status code 404. Does it allow us to do this? I guess can't do it that way. That way? No. Okay. I'll leave out the status code for now. We'll just return our 404 error. So now in our test, we want to check when the ID is null, we should get returned to view with the name of 404. So now I can go back to my test. I mean, Scott, we could use the existing shared error page, but typically 404 errors are treated differently, and most sites have a separate 404 page. So yes, if you wanted to just redirect to the existing shared error page, you can. So now I'm just going to assert .r equal that we expect 404, and we will compare that to the view name that results. So I run my test, and it passes. And so if we call details without an ID, we want to return the 404 page. So that's our first scenario. Our second scenario is almost identical. We just want to pass in an ID that doesn't exist. I'm actually just going to copy that unit test. And I'll change the name to details invalid ID loads 404. And then I just need to pass in any integer value here that doesn't exist in our mock data. So I'm just going to scroll back up to our test initialize for a minute. I've got ID 741, 924, and 683. Any other integer except those three values will work. So if I pass in 1001, I'm going to run my test. But our test fails because our code is not returning a view result right now. It just returns this not found result. So again, in my browser, if I try it out, we get the same error issue. We've got a 404 status, but the user doesn't see anything. They just get a blank screen. So the error handling here is kind of incomplete. Now, sometimes you might need to run them from Test Explorer. It's a little bit buggy. That's why. It doesn't always run all your tests. Try from Test Explorer. So I'm going to go back to the products controller. And on line 46, again, where we're returning the not found code, instead, we want to actually return the 404 view. As soon as I change that code, my live unit testing indicates this should fix the problem. Again, I'll run all my tests. And now they both pass. So I try this now in the browser, I get my 404 page, and our unit test is passing. I'm going to check out my code coverage. We were at like 5% before on our index. Notice it doesn't update. It's one annoying thing, another bug. I think the code coverage should update every time we run the test, but it doesn't. Right? So even though we've now written tests covering these two scenarios, they still show as red. I've actually got to run my code coverage again. And turn on my code coloring. So now the details method is mostly covered. The ID not being null is blue, product not found is now blue, and we are up to 5.6% overall. We're now up to, so the details method, it's mostly covered, 93% covered, but this scenario where we return the view and load the product, we'll need 2 unit tests for this. So we want to make sure if our ID is valid, we get the right product back. We also want to make sure it loads the correct view. So our condition is going to be the same. We could do this in 1 unit test, but I don't recommend it. And some developers do, and you'll find some samples. So we could write 1 test with 2 assert statements. First, that if we pass in a valid ID, we get the right product. And second, that if we pass in a valid ID, the view name is details. My preference and many developers' preference is to write separate unit tests. Even though it's the exact same condition, what would be the benefit of writing 2 separate unit tests? Yes, it's more work, but why is it probably better practice? The developer opinion is somewhat divided on this. So when we pass a valid ID, we want to check that we get the right view, and we want to check we get the right product object. Thanks, Minjin. You're right. We could potentially have separate cause of error. So if we have multiple assert statements and something fails, we don't necessarily know what's wrong with our method. So many developers, and I'm squarely in this camp, believe we should write only 1 assert per test. If you need multiple asserts, that means you need multiple unit tests. Yeah, that's right. It starts defeating the purpose, because then we don't know if something fails, why, because there's multiple possible causes. The idea of a unit test is if your test fails, there should only be 1 cause why it fails. So we'll write first, details, valid ID, loads, product. So I'm going to pass in one of my valid IDs now. Scott, sorry, you did it with multiple asserts or 1? Yeah, I think it makes a lot more sense. So I'm going to pass in one of the IDs from my test initialize method. And now I can assert so this is my stuff to check where in my index is. Yeah, we get more tests, but they're cleaner. So product 924, this is my second product. So the index is 1. So I'm checking that products 1, that's what I'm expecting. That it's equal to the model object of my view result. So if I run that test, it passes. If I use one of the other indexes, it should fail. As soon as I change that and run it again, I'm getting a product back, but it's not the same product. right? Because this ID in my list, so this index matters. If I use the ID of the second product, I need to use index 1. And then I need one more test, but instead of inspecting the data model, I just want to check the name of the view. I want to make sure the details view is loaded. So this is the last test we're going to write today. So the details, valid ID, loads, view. My act, I can again just copy and paste. So when I pass in a valid ID, we should be getting a view called details. Okay. Why did it fail? When I run my test, so this work is kind of weird. Thank you, Attila. Right? We said, much like in our index method, when we were checking the view name, yep, we must explicitly modify the return statement in the details method. So I'm just going to jump back to details. And now on line 49, before we pass the data model, we pass back our matching product with this ID. We've got to specify the name of the view. Again, I can run my tests. Now they all run. If I run, so I've got 4 of 4 passing tests, 1 for no ID, 1 for an invalid ID, 2 different tests with a valid ID, 1 checking the data model, 1 checking the view that gets returned. So I'll add that string parameter. I'll run my code coverage one more time, and my line 49 should turn blue now. So now in the products controller, details, it says, is 100% covered. And now that red highlighting turns to blue. Okay, so we're up to a whopping 6.11% of our code is now covered. Now my unit test class is getting kind of long. If we were going to write, we're not going to write any more tests today, but I'm going to show you a little tip that you can use to organize your code in a really long C# file. You may have seen this before. Visual Studio has this notion of regions. So a region lets us group sections of our code together, and then we can expand or contract the regions to make the file a little more readable. So here I'll use region index with an end region. And then I'm going to move, if I just close up my index tests, right, I've got 2 here, I can drag them inside of the region. And this is totally optional. You don't have to do this. But now I've grouped my index test inside this area of code. So now if I contract it, notice we just see the region name here, but all of the methods are inside of it. I could do the same thing. I add region and end region. I'll just close up my 4 details tests, and then I can just drag them, drag and drop inside. So this helps me organize my code a lot more. All the index tests are in one region. All the details tests are in another. Totally optional. This isn't something you're required to do. But as your code gets longer, this is kind of useful organizing tool. Okay. Save and push. So we've done quite a bit today. We've done, how many unit tests have we got in total? Right? We've got 9 passing unit tests. We've looked at mocking our data and seen how our unit tests with MS Test run. So in terms of your assignment, you can start setting up your unit testing project and your class. You can mock the data, but you won't be able to write all of the tests you need quite yet. But again, make sure you're in class next week and we will do these unit tests together. Your methods say they're excluded from live unit testing. Make sure that your class declaration is public. If it's not public, the live unit testing won't see them. So make sure you got that public declaration. Okay, that's all for this week. If I see a few questions in the chat, I can stay in the room for a little bit and answer questions. Other than that, have an excellent week, everybody. I'll see you all next week.